Museum work. As a leader, today's keynote subject, Leadership and Uncertainty, supporting our teams and ourselves through uncharted territories, is very timely. Being an effective leader is challenging in good times, and it certainly tests us in times of uncertainty and challenge. It's recognized that good leaders support their people, but often, too often, it's at their own personal expense. It's easy to forget, even though the airlines remind us of it on every flight, to put your oxygen mask on first before you help others. And today's keynote speaker certainly knows challenge, and she is a recognized leader. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dorota Bluczyńska. Dorota came to Canada as a child refugee from Poland. She is the CEO of the Manitoba Museum. And prior to working at the museum, she was the executive director of the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization of Manitoba, where her deep sense of social justice and equity shaped her leadership style. Dorota sees her work at the Manitoba Museum as an opportunity to continue to fulfill her purpose of celebrating our shared humanity. She believes that the museum has the opportunity to meaningfully contribute to inclusivity and community cohesion by leaning into its purpose as a living institution and a center for intercultural dialogue. Please join me in welcoming Dorota.
Good morning, friends of the Ontario Museum Association, and happy 50th anniversary. What an absolutely wonderful milestone. I've been looking forward to our time together for quite a while, thinking about what I might share with you on the subject of leadership and uncertainty, and how we can support our teams, but also ourselves, through these uncharted territories. Before I begin, I want to personally acknowledge the immense gratitude I feel for calling Manitoba, where I come from, the lands, waters, and waterways of that beautiful place, my home. As a newcomer to Treaty Number 1 land, the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe and Niniwak, the unceded territories of the Coda, and the homeland of the Red River Métis, I have a responsibility to learn about and understand the harms of the past, the injustices of the present, and to improving relationships in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. And I am forever grateful to live under our shared skies. As I prepared, I journeyed back, re-examining my own origin story, as it has shaped me perhaps more than anything else. And so my remarks this morning are going to be a little bit backwards. We're going to start with uncertainty and then move into leadership. It's important for you to know about my early life because it was fraught with immense uncertainty, and because those experiences helped me learn to cope, to understand how to ground myself. They've helped me gain invaluable perspective on what does and doesn't matter in any particular moment. In my experience, life lessons apply equally well to leadership. The circumstances and the details may be different, but it's all one existence, and so I hope you'll indulge me. I was born 6 months before martial law was introduced and took hold of Poland. My country had been under Soviet occupation for decades, and my earliest years were lived in a time and a place of civil unrest and unease, of food stamps and empty shelves in grocery stores. My parents, like many, were very involved in Solidarność, gathering secretly at the risk of being arrested, plotting to overthrow the Soviet-imposed government. because they wanted to bring democracy to Poland. However, one day, on the heels of something that caused them to no longer feel safe, my mother, pictured here, asked the government for permission to go on holiday. My father had already left the country. So together, the four of us and our mama boarded a train in Poznań, and my grandparents stood on the platform and wept. But I was overjoyed. We were told we were going on vacation, and I hadn't known anyone who had gone on holiday outside of my country. Our train traveled through Czechoslovakia and into Germany. I was 7 years old at the time. At each checkpoint, armed guards would separate my older sisters and I from our mother to ask where and why we were traveling. We're going on vacation. We didn't know the truth, so we couldn't tell the truth. This was in 1988. Our journey ended at a refugee camp where we would live together with hundreds of migrants. During the 1980s, Canada, in response to the unrest in Eastern Europe, introduced a new class of refugees, the political prisoners and oppressed persons class. Through the private refugee sponsorship program, after 14 months, we were resettled to Canada. We came as political refugees. For anyone who might not know, a refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution. They are someone who their government cannot or will not protect. It assumes that their government is a persecutor. And in the case of Eastern Europe, it was understood that communism was the persecutor, and therefore families who were fleeing did not need to provide individual proof of persecution. Living under Soviet occupation qualified anyone who could cross an international border to become a refugee. I was 8 years old when we landed in Winnipeg on October 27th in 1989, 33 years ago. Like many families arriving at that time, we experienced very harsh conditions in the early years. No one spoke of credential recognition, although both my parents had master's degrees that would never be recognized. Both had professional experience that didn't qualify them for work. So like many migrants then and now, they entered into survival employment. And by this time, my youngest brother being born in Germany, we were a family of 7. And it was impossible to provide everything that was needed, and absolutely nothing that was wanted. Within the Polish diaspora, I grew up sheltered from the community that surrounded me. Despite wanting to belong to my friends and my schoolmates and my new country, I did not know how to bridge the reality of my home and the reality of the world outside it. The few glimpses my parents offered to us helped me understand our newest home. Those glimpses included visits to heritage and historical places. On one particular visit to the Manitoba Museum, and if you've been there, you would recognize this is the nonsuch. Within a year of arrival, as we walked through the galleries, immersed in the natural and human histories of the place that was still foreign to us, label copy we could not read and could not understand, my mother turned to me and said in our own language, "Look around, because this is the loom that will weave us in." To my mother, historic, heritage, and cultural places were a way of helping people feel included, perhaps in a space to which they did not belong. Indeed, those rare excursions introduced me to a story of Canada I didn't know, vastly different from what was being taught in school, and unrecognizable against the backdrop of my experiences living in Winnipeg's North End. However, my sheltered reality would come to an abrupt and painful stop not long after. Fast forward a few years, and my mother falls ill. She will not live to see her 5 children grow up. Fearing for our futures, she offers some guidance, at least to her 3 oldest daughters. "What will you become when you grow up?" she asked me one day. A writer, I joyfully shared, showing her my poetry and short stories. She looked away, her face revealing disappointment. Promise me you'll go to university. Promise you'll choose something practical. You'll never put bread on the table writing. And so I promised that I would. She died at 44 years of age, and I was 16. Within a couple months of her death, I became a ward of the child welfare system. Life as I had known it, in the safety and the love of my mother's arms, was forever gone. I was left to fight to survive on my own, as were my sisters, all of us scattered. I was surrounded by cold walls, the echoes of anger, drunken laughter, domestic violence, sex work, all of which bounced off the brick lining of the interior courtyard of a small building I now called home. I aged out of CFS at 18 with nothing, less than nothing. That summer, the Minister of Finance sent me a letter that I owed the province over $800 for unpaid heating bills. You see, when I first went into CFS, the social worker said I was going to a group home, that my father did not have the resources and could no longer care for me. And so I panicked in that moment, because everything I had known was disappearing, and all I wanted was to be alone. And so in that tiny office on Broadway Avenue, I begged the social worker for a chance to live independently. I said, I can cook, I can clean, I'll go to school, I'll never do anything wrong. Hesitantly, they agreed. I was told to find a cheap apartment. They would only pay the rent. And then I would be given an allowance of $187 per month for everything else. For the food, for the bus tickets to school, for the phone line, for clothes, for utilities, and for everything else. In those 2 years, I was often hungry. I stole food from grocery stores. I wore clothes my friends no longer wanted. I walked kilometers to school. And no, I couldn't afford the electric heating bills. Other than on intake day, I never saw a social worker again. The only children in the child welfare system who see social workers more than once are the ones who interact with the justice system, or the ones who are missing, or the ones who are no longer alive. I graduated high school with insufficient credit for university, so I had to go back and upgrade. And I had to get a job right away, understanding that if I wanted to eat, I had to get my own food. I'm skipping pieces of the story for the sake of time, but after a few odd jobs, I landed a position with the Royal Bank in their customer contact center. At 19, I started to learn about savings and budgeting and building credit. I worked full-time, and I attended university full-time, including spring and summer sessions. And it took me much longer than it might have taken others, but eventually I did graduate with a Bachelor of Business Administration. And during that time, I also climbed the corporate ladder. In my early 20s, I had a mutual fund license to sell investments as part of retirement planning. I completed mortgage applications for clients, and I oversaw their entire financial portfolios. And it was all in front of me. The employment certainty, the pension. I could have retired at 55. If only I had followed the path that lay ahead. It was everything my mother had wished for. But I wasn't happy. Maybe it wasn't even about happiness. I wasn't fulfilling my purpose. I was doing, and nothing was changing. And as naive as it felt then, and sometimes it still feels naive now, I wanted to change the world. At least I wanted to try. And I knew that building a secure life for myself and myself alone wasn't the way to do that. And so the universe intervened, and I walked away from that secure job and I did a second degree in English with a focus on creative writing for my own soul. And I had my beautiful son, the first of my 3 kids. And one day I found myself in the basement of an inner city school with my baby on my hip, volunteering with refugee women learning English. IRCOM, the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization of Manitoba, found me. And I felt that I had found home again. In a small not-for-profit, much like in a small museum, every person is a leader. Rather, they can be a leader if they so choose. Every person does whatever is needed to support the organization, to secure funding, to deliver programs, to share impact stories, to account for expenses and manage the resources, to build relationships with supporters and to champion the work. At the grassroots level, where you see the direct impact of inadequate policies and gaps in supports, you quickly learn that all your efforts aren't sufficient if you're not working to change the conditions upstream. But there is no greater school of leadership than a small not-for-profit, but especially one in human services, where the stakes are very high, because the work involves supporting community members as they fight for access to life's basic necessities: shelter, food, healthcare, education. But not just doing that work, but doing it in such a way that is dignified, that does not judge the circumstances, that helps to restore a sense of optimism, that invites hope back into each person's heart. At IRCOM, I began to understand also how I had a stake in the place that I now called home. I stopped feeling less a visitor and ever more that I belonged, or that I could belong. And in my search for belonging, I was putting together how my own life had prepared me very precisely for what lay ahead. You see, working in the midst of struggle, it is natural to look at one's own life and feel the inequities. I often felt terribly guilty. Regardless of what I had personally survived, I was okay now. I was uneasy about my improved life and the difficult life of the community I served. But at a population scale, I couldn't make better what systems, by design, made worse. I also couldn't turn away because I knew from my own life what it felt like to be invisible and to be forgotten. In my 13 years at IRCOM, one of the most profound lessons that helped me reframe my work was something a community member said to me. When you are grateful for all that you have, you honor all that I've lost. It wasn't about charity, but about shared humanity. It wasn't about doing the right thing for the right reasons, but because you believe in justice, because you see your own life story in the stories of others. Stories. That is what brought me to the Manitoba Museum. And just to be clear, I'm not a museum expert or a seasoned museum professional. I imagine all of you have far, far more expertise than I do. I've only been in my role for a year and a half, and I don't come from a background of museology or history. And if I'm very honest, in the last year and a half, the subject matter has absolutely kicked my ass. So my bits of wisdom aren't going to help you with collections or conservation, or exhibit creation, or the development of public programs, or the management of facilities. But I do hope that they might help with how each of us, in all of our positions of leadership, can continue to move forward with courage, despite all of the uncertainty and the shifting land beneath our feet. So, a few lessons I've learned along the way. I am that dinosaur. A few times during our Ultimate Dinosaur exhibition, I put on this costume and I greeted visitors. I gave kids hugs, I high-fived teenagers, which humiliated my 16-year-old. I snuck up on little ones, which sent them crying and screaming to their parents, so I stopped doing that quickly. But whenever possible, I left my office and I spent time with our communities, the children and the adults, sometimes just watching them as they marveled at the museum's incredible work. And so what I took away from that is that part of leadership is to be joyfully present. Lesson 2 is to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, not to the point that it cements you to your present reality, but so it can fuel you towards change. And it's okay for two things, even more than two things, to exist at the same time. To love working in a museum, and at times to be ashamed of its failures, its lack of vision, its poor self-awareness regarding the harms it causes through narratives it perpetuates. It's okay to be grateful for the opportunity to do this work, which I am, while I desperately want the work to evolve. I want it to tell stories like mine. I want it to be more honest. I want it to be more nuanced. I want it to be more raw. To be a part of something while working to take it apart. Nothing, I promise you this, nothing is permanent. Because we are not permanent. The world exists as it does, through our lives. And so when we expire, so will the version of reality that we have created. So loosen your grip on the idea of permanence. Deconstruct what someone else built, because now you know better. And all the while understand that others will come along one day and yet again deconstruct what you're creating. That ought to be a source of joy for all of us, that everything is allowed to change. The third lesson, and I'm sorry for all the words on this slide, and we all know this, is to lead by example. This is an email I sent to my colleagues over the summer when I took my 3 kids on holiday and I said, I'm tapping out. Understand that this work has and will continue to span generations. You are not moving the mountain alone. In fact, we are here to pick up a pebble or two, to put it in our pocket and move it further down the path, along the side, marking a trail for others to be guided by. Guide others in caring for themselves by caring for yourself. The fourth lesson, and I really love this one, and you'll look it up hopefully later tonight, is there's this wonderful TED Talk called Humor Your Stress. And I'm not going to play it, but it's this wonderful Sicilian lady who's living in the Bronx, who I'm going to try to impersonate in a moment. Now, side note, there are parts of her talk that I'm like, I don't entirely agree with you. But there's one piece that I really love, and I think it comes around 10 minutes or so, which she shares about how we have to humor our stress. And she says this: stop awfulizing and catastrophizing. That's it. That's as good as it gets. But the point of it is that it's part of that being joyfully present. It's do not lean into what is hard and what is challenging. It is about not making something into what it isn't. So I hope you watch the TED Talk, because I think you'll really enjoy it. Next is to understand the scale of our efforts. So this is a little bit about dialing back the ego. We have to understand that proportionately what we do may be small, and that's okay. But I think while we recognize that, we should never underestimate the impact that our efforts have on others. So we may be doing something quite small. We might be adjusting a label copy. We might be putting a certain artifact or specimen on exhibit and replacing another. It may feel inconsequential. But I can tell you that in walking through the Manitoba Museum and seeing artifacts that represent my own culture and my own community and my own heritage brought me to tears, because I understood that I had a place. and that it was important, and that my identity was important. And so what we create, what leaves our hands, may in fact be the one thing that someone has been searching for. And so offer the world your absolute best. So this morning at 7:02, I welcomed the 676th, no, that's not, I can't say this word, sunrise in a row. 676 sunrise in a row. 9 months into COVID, so this was back in 2020, while I was still at the previous organization, and we were supporting newly arrived refugee families, many who had barely made it out of active conflict zones, and now the world was falling apart, and we were just trying to keep their little corner of it together. I felt so exhausted, and I felt deeply lost, and I think like many, I felt so profoundly disconnected from community, and community being my source of purpose and light and joy. And so everything felt out of control, and everything felt uncertain. There was no guarantee. At least it kind of felt that way. So on January 1st, 2021, on a very cold morning in Winnipeg, I walked out of my home and meandered to a bridge close by overlooking the Assiniboine River. I took pictures of it every day and shared them with my community. These are some of my favorites from 2021. I watched the sunrise. I felt the warmth embrace me, and I saw the light lift up over the horizon and bounce off the snow. And momentarily, I felt hope return to me. And so I did it again the next day, and the day after that, and after that, and after that. And well, here we are today, and I'm still out there in the early morning. And it would be 2 weeks into this newfound restorative practice that I'd learn about the opportunity at the Manitoba Museum. What I'd understand at that point was that it was time to seek out a new beginning, to yet again be uprooted, but this time by choice, this time knowing I would be a part of something on the cusp of extraordinary. Because the museum was ready for change, not incremental, but to take an evolutionary leap and to be transformed. You see, I came to the Manitoba Museum not because I was entrenched in what it had been, but because I was in love with what it could be. And I knew what it meant to me as a child. Day by day, just as I returned to sunrise, we began the work of reimagining what we could be in service to our communities, in service to justice, in service to the planet, in service to science and learning and discovery. We decentered ourselves and recentered our communities. And in this reorientation, we fundamentally shifted our raison d'être, because in the face of uncertainty, we had to be reminded, we needed to remember who was at the heart of our efforts, and that helped us move through the fog. So these are just a few quick lessons that I've also learned along the way that I just wanted to very quickly share with you. So the first one, and this might go against museological practice, so just be patient with me. MVP stands for minimally viable product. And in most businesses, it's about progress over perfection. And I know that we're very thoughtful in our museum work, that things are really well done and really well laid out and well presented. But we are now in the phase of just letting some minimally viable products go because change and progress demands that we abandon our grip on perfection. The 3 C's of leadership, and I've also learned this a bit through my own journey, are capacity, commitment, and care. But what happens to leaders when we're under pressure and in times of stress is that we tend to lean into capacity. So we're just going to work harder. I'm just going to work harder. Or we lean into commitment. I'm just going to work more hours and more hours. But really what's needed in tandem with increased effort is the care part. We have to care for one another and ourselves. And I put boundaries, perhaps more importantly than balance, is because if I'm honest, I don't know that there's balance in work, this work, leadership, any work. It's kind of a little bit of like this BS that we say, because the reality is that life spills into work. I have 3 small children. They have been at the museum on random work days. And my work spills into my life. So it's not really balanced. But I do have some boundaries. I do put up some edges of my sandbox. And so it's clear about when I'm not there for that moment. But otherwise, within, we can play and innovate and test and explore and take great risks. And vulnerability. That's about allowing yourself to be seen, as I've tried to do a bit this morning, as a complete, imperfect, erroneous, not all-knowing being. So stop pretending to have all the answers. Ask the good questions. Make the best decisions you can with what you have in front of you in the moment. And when the facts evolve or more information comes to light, bring others along with your learning and change direction. Never be afraid to correct a decision made on incomplete information. That is the poorest form of leadership, is digging your feet in versus admitting this is what I knew at the time and I did the best I could with what I knew and now I know better, so I'm going to do it differently. And the last one is love. And maybe this ought to be easy or self-explanatory. And folks in HR, some folks in HR have cautioned me that, there is no room for love and leadership. But they entirely go together. I just don't agree with that. It's precisely because I love my community that I have chosen to lead, because I love the responsibility we have to one another's humanity. And in my mind, we live into that responsibility in a particularly unique and beautiful way in museums. We curate. And you all know what to curate means, but I'm just going to say it anyways. So to curate means to select from limitless possibilities, the few items that will be saved for long into the future, the few that bore witness to our lives today and will tell those stories to generations of our descendants. When we curate well, we choose in balance items that honor, amplify, and propel into the future diverse, difficult, underrepresented, systemically excluded stories. But when we curate through a value system that fails to see, validate, document histories as lived by all who were present in them, we risk erasing those stories, and we risk the danger of a single story. And on that note, this is the second assignment for later today. So first one was humoring your stress. This is the second one. I encourage you to also Google a TED Talk entitled The Danger of a Single Story, if you've never seen it, by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a Nigerian writer, because she beautifully explains what we lose when we marry ourselves to one story of a person, of a nation, of a time, of a people. Imagine if the story of 16-year-old me would come to define my existence. Stories must be allowed to unfold and evolve because they are living and because they are important. There are few organizations, I think, who can tell stories as powerfully, if they choose, as fulsomely, if they listen, and as accurately, if they dare, as museums can. I think that is why we exist. I think that's also why I came to the Manitoba Museum, for all the beautiful stories. And to honor my own story, to help bring people and community together, to bring us in closer proximity to one another so that we can be kin to each other and care for and love one another. Because it's not just about surviving, and it's not just about dismantling systems and making change, but it is so we can intentionally and by design reclaim the beauty of our lives, despite the circumstances. Through stories, museums can help to create spaces for healing, for community cohesion, for difficult conversations, for contesting and challenging historical and contemporary narratives, for amplifying previously silenced voices and experiences. We can indeed be agents of change, faced with our own complicated truth as colonial institutions, and yet committed to sitting in that discomfort so that with time and work, with trust rebuilt and relationships rekindled, we too can be transformed. Change comes from a place of discomfort, and to willingly be uncomfortable requires courage. And so my long remarks have ultimately led to this. As in life, so in leadership, in times of uncertainty, first and foremost, we must be courageous. Everything else is in the delivery. For this honor, miigwech, dziękuję wam bardzo. Thank you, merci beaucoup.
Let's consider this the request for an encore. Are there any questions? We have a few more minutes, so please be courageous. There are some microphones at the back. I'll give you back the mic.
Okay. You can also shout them out. Yes. Oh. Okay, never mind.
This is a little personal, but I'm just curious about your siblings. How are they doing?
They're okay. You know, my sisters were 19 and 21 when our mom passed away, and my brothers were 8 and 10. And so in Manitoba, a parent can they can give away their parental right to their child. And so my father had made the case to the government that as a single parent, he didn't have the means to support 3 children under 18. And so he kept the boys, and I got to go off into the world. But we're all okay. We're coping in our own ways. You know, one of my brothers went back home to Poland. We're still searching, for our identities. I think it's very difficult for migrant children especially, who are caught between kind of 2 worlds, 2 identities, 2 realities. But we're doing okay. Yeah, thank you. Any other non-museum question? Because I totally don't know museums. Love my museum. Okay. Hearing none. Well, I'm here, and if anybody wants to chat, I'm very happy to chat. So thank you again.
On behalf of everyone in the room and online, thank you so much for sharing your story. Although you're new to the museum field, your words today have demonstrated that you are solidly present in the many issues and discussions that the field is struggling with. Thank you again for your insight, for leading one of our sister museums, and we welcome you to continue the conversation with us.